Good afternoon, and welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts Mellon Lecture Series. I'm Courtney J. Martin, the Paul Mellon Director of the Yale Center for British Art. I am delighted to welcome Thelma Golden, Director and Chief Curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, to our program today. Before we begin, please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound will be muted throughout. You will be using the Q&A feature located on the navigation bar to gather your questions. These questions will be answered at the end of the discussion, but please feel free to submit them at any time. As always, closed captioning is available. Yale University and the Yale Center for British Art acknowledge that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chigatecoke, Golden Hill Pawgusset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people populated the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Established in 1994, this lecture series was named in honor of Paul Mellon, Yale College Class of 1929. Mellon was a philanthropist, an art collector, and founder of both the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven and the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art Studies in London. Co-organized by the two institutions, the biennial lectures were first delivered in person by a specialist in British art at both the National Gallery in London and in New Haven at the YCBA. This year's series is a departure from the past. Entitled The Museum and Gallery Today, it is exclusively online and features talks by some of the world's most distinguished museum directors. Thus, I am pleased to welcome Thelma Golden, Director and Chief Curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, the world's leading institution devoted to visual arts by artists of African descent. Golden began her career as a Studio Museum intern in 1987. In 1988, she joined the Whitney Museum of American Art, where she launched her influential curatorial practice. Her groundbreaking exhibition, Black Male: Representations of Masculinity in Contemporary American Art from 1994, changed the ways in which contemporary American art could and would be shown thereafter. In 2000, she returned to the Studio Museum as Deputy Director for Exhibitions and Programs, working closely with then-director Lowry Stokes Sims. She succeeded Dr. Sims as director in 2005. Under her leadership, the Studio Museum has gained increased renown as a global leader in the exhibition of contemporary art, a center for innovative education, and a cultural anchor in the Harlem community. The Studio Museum has long given curators and other cultural workers their start in the field. And Golden has continued this long tradition of mentoring and seeding the field with innovative thinkers. Her lecture today is entitled Creating Space, the Studio Museum, Past and Present. Please welcome Thelma Golden.
Thank you, Courtney, for that amazing introduction. I want to thank you and the entire Yale Center for British Art team for inviting me to do this Paul Mellon lecture at home. So I'm sending greetings to the whole audience from Harlem. Courtney, when you asked me to participate in this amazing series, it felt like the most appropriate thing for me to do was to meditate on the Studio Museum in Harlem, the institution where I've been proud to be associated with since I was in college as an intern, and then in the last 21 years as first Chief Curator, and now as the Director of the museum. At this moment in the museum's life, thinking about the institution as a place that has created space in all the ways we can understand that is a really powerful and productive way to understand the history, the legacy, and the possibility of the Studio Museum, past, present, and future. So I'd like to begin with the slides to talk a little bit about our past. Second, actually, image, please. Next image, please. I want to start here with a work from our collection, Jacob Lawrence's painting The Architect from 1959, an icon of our collection, but one with special and deep symbolism at this moment, as the Studio Museum in Harlem has been closed since 2018 as we've embarked on a major building project. The actuality of this building project, which I'll talk about later in this talk, was really about creating a new home for the Studio Museum. But the act of building, of envisioning, of creating has always been inherent to the DNA of the institution. Next slide, please. The Studio Museum was founded in a moment similar to the one we were in now. In the late 60s, as this country reckoned with its past and imagined its way through protest into a future, the Studio Museum was born. In Harlem, a group of community activists, artists, philanthropists, educators, civic leaders came together, and in an imagining of a Harlem that could see beyond what was this sort of moment of major disinvestment, right, in the community, and a moment where the needs of the Harlem community were very well known. The idea of creating an art institution as part of that growth was a radical idea. The founders, and in this image is a picture of our founders. The second woman from the right of the screen is the artist Betty Blayton Taylor. Also in this image, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Carter Burden, Charles Innes, Frank Donnelly. This group of people, right, this multicultural, multiracial group, came together with the idea that Harlem, a community known for its role in the thinking about Black America, could and should also tie itself to its large cultural history. Harlem, of course, where the Harlem Renaissance was birthed, arguably one of the most important cultural movements of the 20th century, but also quite literally, where in an expression of Black culture, the idea of arts and culture being key to understanding the humanity of Black people, of being able to live within the history of Black people, was well known throughout the cultural institutions. So in this New York Times article, which relates it, this Harlem, and I love, this headline because it really was that we were founded by a group of people representing, right, many facets of this community and beyond, created this art museum, right, the first in Harlem. This is original home at 2033 Fifth Avenue. Next image, please. Throughout the museum's life, the idea of the physical space we existed in was thought about in a way that is related to the architectural and planning idea of adaptive reuse. Our first space was above a liquor store, second story loft. Our second home, of course, was a former bank building. But in both cases, it was the idea to populate these spaces with the activity of a museum. I say it was a really bold idea in the naming of who we are to place museum there at a moment where many in the art world were reconsidering the idea of a museum as even being relevant and moving to other kinds of art spaces. Next image, please. From the very moment of our founding, this was an early press release from the museum, the studio program, where the studio in our name comes from, was seen as being central to who we were as an institution. This press release is relaying, of course, that the first artist to participate in the program was Tom Lloyd, who was also the first artist who was featured in our inaugural exhibition. Next image, please. And this is the image that went along with that press release of Tom Lloyd in his studio in Queens. Tom Lloyd was an artist who worked with light, created these sculptures, very, very early investigator of technology and its potential, and also someone in exploring, right, the potential of light and sculptural work. In his studio, he maintained an apprentice-like program, and that very much was at the core of the thinking around the studio program. Next image, please. But a lot of what was important in our founding years was this idea of creating space, cultural space, space for engaging, space for gathering, space for presenting. This is an image of that first space. You see our sign there, but above, you know, what was then Fifth Avenue between 125th Street and 126th Street. Humble beginnings, but invested deeply with ambition and aspiration that we continue to live with today. Next image, please. In 1979, under the leadership of then the museum's director, Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, the museum acquired this building at 144 West 125th Street, a former office building and bank that was built in about 1914 that became ours and became the studio museum that many people know and love. This space was renovated for the museum by the museum's longtime friend, board member, supporter, the architect J. Max Bond, the late architect J. Max Bond. And Max very provocatively kind of imagined what it could mean to turn this building from its original use into a museum space, and what that could mean not only for the museum in its desire to steward and present the work of artists of African descent, but what this also meant for the Harlem community. Next image. This is an image of the gallery space as it first was presented in 1981 when we opened this building. This space that you are now seeing installed with works from the museum's collection, along with some loans at that time, is the space that was the bank's main customer area. So it was often quite profound to greet visitors to the museum who knew the building in its former use and understood this transition. This space is one that we lived in and loved what opportunities it presented for us up until 2018. So much of the work that is known from the Studio Museum really bridges these two spaces, Fifth Avenue and 125th Street and 144 West 125th Street. I'm speaking about space, and again, I titled this talk Creating Space because so much of this place we are in now is in this thinking about space. But I also want to say that this moment in the museum really established the mission, which was one that was about collecting the work of artists of African descent, presenting that work, creating the opportunities for education, engagement, entertainment within the space of the museum. But it also began the museum's deep commitment to advocacy. Advocacy for the presence of Black artists within our understandings of art histories as they had been written and needed to be written. So that this also, in having a museum and creating a museum, it was about the way in which the museum could have a role in shifting how we understood our understanding of art through an understanding of the contributions of Black artists. Next image, please. And this is the building as it looked up until 2018, before we closed and began to move into this sort of major project that we're engaged in now. But before talking about the project, I'd love to really dig into a moment to our mission. I often say that the gift of our founders is that they really put our mission into the name of the institution. Now, the Studio Museum was founded within the principles of a culturally specific institution. We came out of an activist spirit. Our founders understood that with the exclusion of Black artists, from museums around New York City and the country in the late 60s. By creating an institution, they could create a space that would stand as a voice of authority around this community of artists and the community of ideas from curators, art historians, and critics that really created this fuller picture of art. But also in the naming of us and creating in our name this sense of mission, it also has continued to allow us to live within both our present, but to engage a past and think about the future. For me, this has always been important because that's how I think about Harlem. Harlem is one of those communities where you find often that people talk about what Harlem was, right? There's an incredible amount of nostalgia for this storied community and its incredible history, but they also often talk about Harlem in relation to what it will be, right? So there's always a way of being in the past and in the future. And what is so important when I think about this incredible history of the Studio Museum is the way in which it's lived in the present to be able to capture, right, both the past and imagine into the future. As an art museum, right, so much for me about what makes art so important is its capacity for imagining futures, for future making. But in our life as an institution, this has been embedded in who we are and how we have imagined our program, our mission, our cause in many ways. Next image, please. You know, this was really a way, you know, of just thinking about, you know, there are many, many different people who've thought about the life of the museum, but thinking about where and how we have been as an interlocutor, right, to these ruptures, shifts, and the spectra of experiences of artists of African descent as they have lived and worked over the time of our 5 decades of life. Next image, please. So the name, Studio Museum in Harlem. Start with studio. Next slide, please. As I said, built into the name of the institution is the name studio. And that is because at our founding, the artist William T. Williams, recent graduate of the School of the Arts at Yale, was tasked with the idea as he imagined and knew that there was the potential for what could be in a museum setting, an active residency program, a studio program that would offer Black artists the opportunity to engage with their own practice, with audience and with community. And so from our very founding, Tom Lloyd being the first artist, we have been privileged to have 3 artists every year with studios in the museum building. Next slide, please. This just shows an example. This is Jordan Castile's work, who was pictured in the image before. And it's really important to imagine that over these years that artists come to Harlem to participate in the residency. They come to Harlem to spend time in the studio to engage with each other. Each cohort begins their dialogue, but they also engage deeply with the neighborhood itself. Harlem becoming important to them, not just as a place that they are existing, but in many cases as a place that can inform and influence their practice. Next image, please. We've been thrilled to have a range of artists in different practices working. This is Allison Janae Hamilton. Next slide, please. Image of the work of Kehinde Wiley, whose practice as we know it now began during this studio program as he began to find the nature of not simply, right? He already came into our program, again, post Yale School of the Arts and post his time at San Francisco Art Institute as a painter, deeply committed to figurative painting, but the politics of that painting formed and shaped very deeply in his time, in his year in Harlem. Next image, please. And then Leonardo Drew, just a few of the many, many artists who have been part of the residency program and that have formed what it means to think about this idea of the studio being part of the museum itself. In the original building, what was so interesting to me is that original loft space, this gallery space, the presentation space was the front, the studios were in the back, and audiences got the chance to actually engage with the artists as they were working. And I think about what a profound experience that would have been, particularly as in those years and continued, the Studio Museum has always been committed to creating new audiences. So for so many people, their experience of museum was defined not just by this presentation of object, this engagement with objects, but with the engagement with the makers themselves, with artists and their voices very directly. Next slide, please. Of course, studio, then museum. As I mentioned earlier, I've always found it somewhat profound that at the very moment the Studio Museum was being founded, it was at a time when many in the arts communities around this country and the world were rejecting the idea of museums, looking at museums as a figment of a past, right? This kind of idea that perhaps there was a different way. Artists demanded, art practices demanded different ways to present work. And out of that, of course, we've gotten some of the most interesting and innovative late 20th century spaces, which reimagined what it meant to work with artists and present their work. I think the founders of the Studio Museum, however, were very intentional that while their ideals were incredibly radical, looking towards a future, they wanted to claim all the ideas and ideals of museum, but embed them within this idea of cultural specificity, as well as infuse them with African-American culture and Black artists. Also, museum became important because in Harlem, we live in community with many other arts institutions, but very specifically 10 blocks to the north of us, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a branch of the New York Public Library founded almost 100 years ago by Arturo Schomburg to be a repository of the material culture, books, artifacts of Black people, of Black culture. And so in many ways, also our founding as a museum was also citing us within this context of institutions that already existed, and very specifically one in our neighborhood that defined itself around this very primary role, right, to be a steward of the culture. Next slide, please. I'll move through these. So as a museum, the museum committed itself to collection. This work by Barclay Hendricks, Lottie Mama is the name of this painting, a portrait, very much an icon of our collection, a work that Barclay referred to as our Madonna. So we have always held this work in great esteem, as it lives so much as a work so identified with the museum, but also as an example of the almost 3,000 works that the museum has collected over its history. Next image, please. Important to this work has not been just the studio program and our exhibition program and our collection, but our exhibition program, which throughout its history has created exhibitions that have been important, significant, and unique to our mission. This Chris O'Feely's exhibition of his watercolors, Afro Muses, that happened in 2005. Next slide, please. The series of emerging artist exhibitions that we presented between 2001 and 2018, all beginning with the letter F, the first being freestyle, but then frequency. This image of work by Nick Cave included in frequency. Next exhibition, next slide, please. Images from the last iteration of that exhibition, Fictions. Next image, please. Of course, survey exhibitions. This was our survey of Alma Thomas's work, an artist who had a survey exhibition at the Studio Museum in the 80s, shortly after the two groundbreaking exhibitions she had, one at the Whitney Museum, the other at the Corcoran in the mid-70s, in both cases making her the first African-American woman to have exhibitions in those institutions. But then this exhibition coming a few years ago as a way to reconsider her work, right, within the larger art historical reconsiderations that then created more depth of understanding of her innovation. There is an exhibition currently on view, or maybe it's just over, of Alma Thomas's work. And this is a place at which at the Studio Museum, we see ourselves working a continuum, right? Creating often first opportunities or critically timed opportunities that hopefully always open up more space for the continuation of engagement with artists both past and present. Next slide, please. But, in the context of, thinking about the museum, it for us has always been important to think about this space as one that exists within the context of our program, but also exists within the context of our many, many beloved and important publics. This is an image of the opening of the Fictions exhibition with, on the wall there, work by Christina Quarles, Texas Isaiah, Amy Sherald, that I can see here. Next slide, please. Publics as they exist in the physical space, but also the publics that we reach through publications, catalogs, of course, but significantly for us, the magazine that we produce, Studio, which for us has been a way to bring the program to audiences in this print form around the world. Next image, please. But having museum in our title means that we have had to live within a space of institutional critique of museums, right? Again, our founders in their activism of thinking of wanting to change the museum landscape. This was so much a part of their conversation, but it continues for us as we balance, reimagine, and reinvent ourselves in each different era of the museum's life, of understanding the different ways in which a museum can be understood. Simply a place for art with people, a place for people with art. We have always seen at the Studio Museum in our history our ability to navigate these two places, to be deeply, deeply rooted in our mission from an art historical and museological place, but deeply, deeply committed to audience and the engagement with audience. Personally, for me, it's why I think my time at the Studio Museum has been so important and significant in my own trajectory, because as a curator, I've always seen myself as an interlocutor between audiences, artists, objects, and the ideas. So for the institution, right, to form this space, physical space, but also intellectual space, in many ways, emotional space, is an important way in which we continue to see the significance of our work. Next image, please. That roots, of course, in exhibition, presentation, and collection, but also significantly in education. This is Stanley Whitney talking to one of our school partners when his exhibition was on view at the museum. And this idea of having the museum sit in the space of our education community as not just a resource, but an active partner in thinking about what experiences provide opportunity and possibility to young people in the Harlem community and throughout the city. Next image, please. This happens both in our physical space of the museum and then outside of the museum. In this moment, while we are closed, we've created a program called Find Art Here, where reproductions from our collection are in schools, community centers, all kinds of public spaces in and around Harlem. And this has allowed our educators here, Jennifer Harley, who runs this program, to engage with audiences in their environment. This is at one of our school partners, with artworks in reproduction that they can have in their spaces for a long period of time while we engage with them offsite as we build the new building. Next slide, please. And of course, this just image of site-specific work that was created for us by the artist Glenn Ligon called Give Us a Poem, the title taken from words of Muhammad Ali when giving a lecture at Harvard in the late 60s. After the lecture was asked in the form of a question, give us a poem, and he got up and said, me, we. Right? And those words the me, and the we. Glenn making this neon, which existed in our atrium space, visible from the street, visible while we were open, but also at night when we were closed. So a work that could have an experience for people who didn't even come into the museum, but also stood as iconic, as a place, a physical place, as a way to mark our space as one defined by Black artists and ideas. Next image, please. And then Harlem. So in 1969, Harlem existed within the space of activism. It was a community that was speaking to its need, a community that was living sort of deeply, right, in the moment of an understanding of reimagining, right? All of the many, many, many conversations that we are having now in our culture were happening in Harlem in many similar ways. And so for the founders of the museum to put Harlem in our name, to cite us in this community, is a geographical designation, but also one that was speaking to Harlem as an idea. Next slide, please. I show here one of dozens of works I could have shown out of the work of Romare Bearden, artist who was a founder of the Studio Museum, an artist who spent a significant part of his career in Harlem and made many works that resonate with the spirit of the community. This one, The Dove from 1964. Next image, please. And then these words, of course. Harlem is vicious modernism, bang clash, vicious the way it's made. Can you stand such beauty, so violent and transforming? This is from Amiri Baraka's poem, Return of the Native. Next image, please. So engaging with Harlem, Harlem both of its past and Harlem of its present, always was the way in which I think our founders wanted to cite the museum and what it was and what it could be in this neighborhood. This is an image that really just shows in many ways, the understanding of the complexity, right, of a community that lives within a history cited in a culture and a people, lives within a sense of a visual way in which it lives in the world, but also is living in very 21st century urban issues, gentrification, relocation, all sorts of ways in which the community is transforming. And so as an arts institution, we have lived within a sense of how can we hold space in this moment of transformation? How can we hold still a space to acknowledge what these transformations are? And how can we move forward to be present in the Harlems that are coming in our future? Next image, please. So Harlem feels, always so present. And one core of our collection, of course, are works that really speak to picture Harlem. And this perhaps no more than that is Lorraine O'Grady's one image from her suite of photographs, which document her 1983 performance Art Is, which happened in conjunction with the African American Day Parade, which still happens in Harlem every year through the streets of Harlem, and Lorraine's performance intervention into that in 1983. So a wonderful work in our collection, sort of picture, right? Again, a moment of the many moments in which this community informs so deeply. Next image, please. We love the way in which the understanding of Harlem is one that is mythical and that is felt by all. I often say, no matter where I go in the world, of course, people know New York City, but to say Harlem often prompts, right, a great sense of deep emotion for what is seen as the incredible history and legacy of the Harlem community. But it is an important history and legacy that it defines very much the institution. Next image, please. So in 2018, when we closed, it became clear across our Studio Museum team that while we would be closed, that we would still engage deeply, that we still wanted to think about ways to bring artist voices into the community and the city and the world at large, and began a program called In Harlem, right? Coming from our name, the Studio Museum in Harlem. Often our name is mistaken to be the Studio Museum of Harlem. And while, that can be challenging sometimes, right? That idea that that mistake is making, it is something we embrace because we are a museum that is in Harlem, cited, rooted, but we're also of Harlem, right? Representing all of its sensibility. So the In Harlem project was one that allowed us the possibility of what it meant to be in Harlem. So the next few images, and I'll ask Linda if maybe you just can go through the next three, which allow us to understand these projects that are happening in our Harlem parks, which is one, projects that are happening as a way for us to engage with audiences, projects happening in other spaces. This is one branch of the New York Public Library in Harlem, projects that bring artists, this case Andre Wagner and Kambui Ojimi, into the library to create this project above the library stacks, but bringing our programs to a new audience. But also in the ways that, again, the next slide just again harkens back to this idea of being a space of gathering and allowing us as a space of gathering to meet and engage audiences everywhere. Next slide, please. Also, however, this moment was one that allowed us the possibility to reach out into the country as a whole. So working in collaboration with our amazing colleagues at American Federation for the Arts, AFA, we had a traveling show titled Black Refractions, which surveyed many works, iconic works from our collection that travel to a number of institutions across the country. So it was thrilling to see our collection in these other communities. Now, unfortunately, the tour, of course, was impacted by all that was going on in the world. So I have a deep amount of gratitude to our institutional peers that managed to make this exhibition still happen in the midst of it all, and to have these works travel around the country representing the institution. So that's the past and the present. But really, in thinking about creating space, so much of that is about our future. And our future is about this new building that is being designed for us by Sir David Adjaye, his firm Adjaye Associates, and Cooper Robertson, with a brief that looked to not only create an institution that would be a state-of-the-art purpose-built museum, the first in the Studio Museum's history, but one that would also resonate with our core mission, as is laid out in our name, and to take on some ideas that for me characterize the experience of Harlem. And those three ideas were the ideas of the street, the stage, and the sanctuary. Next image, please. That I think really are a way to understand Harlem, the life of the street, and how so much of what we can consider life happens out on the streets of Harlem. The stage and the place of the stage literally, and the performing arts more broadly in our understanding of Harlem and the way it's presented Black culture to the world. And the sanctuary, because of the way in which the community is defined by its relationship to spirituality and houses of worship, and how those physical spaces exist in the community as central to the place of gathering, the place of engagement, places of information, places of uplift, places of aspiration, places of activism. So the street, the stage, and the sanctuary formed a brief. Next image, please. That then, this initial sketch by David Adjaye, where he took some inspiration from Harlem, being a community in all of its architectural types that was defined by these apertures or windows out to the world. So his idea to create a space for us that embodied all of this internally, but also looked out to the world. Next image, please. In this design, the idea was to create a building that would be site-specific, site-sensitive, site-suggestive, and site-significant. And with that, next image, please. This image is the exterior of what is going to be the new Studio Museum in Harlem, a building that, as I say, for the first time in the museum's history, purpose-built around our continuing desire to present the works of artists of African descent and work inspired by Black culture, to do so in a way that centers education and engagement for audiences locally, nationally, and from around the world. Next image, please. These two images again show the facade on 125th Street as well as on 124th Street. This building is rising out of the space where our former building was. So we took on a project of demolishing the old building. Now we're in the process of laying a foundation. Very significantly, about a week ago, almost 2 weeks ago, we had a cornerstone ceremony really marking the beginning of our construction of this building coming up, and then our movement towards, of course, reopening. Next image, please. This just again shows a bit of the roof condition. This is a 7-story building, 6 stories at its interior, because it engages some double height on the inside, but also has a full roof that will be open to the public. And now, before we move to a Q&A and a conversation with Courtney, I would love to share an animation that shows the design of the building in its totality.
Thelma, thank you for an incredible talk. You have given us so much to think about. I have several questions that are already queued up that are looking and asking about the architecture.
Yes.
The first question that we have here about architecture is a great one. Norwood Creech asks, would you be able to discuss the process of selecting the architect or architecture for the new design?
Yes. So when we began this process to think about what it might be to re-envision our space, we didn't originally begin with the idea of a full new building, right? So it was somewhat an iterative process that looked very practically first, just at needs, right? As I said, it was a 1914 building, so there were needs. Over the years leading up to this, from the time we moved in the building to 1981, the museum and our most significant partner in the physical space of the museum, which is the city of New York, we're part of something called the Cultural Institutions Group, huge investments had been made in upgrading the building. So anyone who'd been to the building knows over years, we got a new lobby, a lower level space, new gallery space. So we looked at what it would be to continue along that path. And so our first set of investigations were looking at renovation and looking at it in that way. When it became clear that there was a real possibility, we began with a group of about 15 firms and kind of looked at a range of work that they'd done in the museum or art space. We also looked at a group of firms that we thought perhaps had done work, not maybe in museums, but in urban space, right? Thinking about this building being on 125th Street, narrowed to 7, went into a interview process, kind of full day interview presentations with 3, and came to then a process to make a selection of Adjay Associates. And that took about a year, I would say, of work. And it was a committee combined of board and staff that participated in the process.
You know, Thelma, I look back at your career, and you know, one of your earliest positions was in my all-time favorite museum, architecturally in the world, the Breuer Building, that was, you know, previously the home of the Whitney Museum of American Art. Did curating some of your first major exhibitions in that building change the way that you understand working with space, working with architects and architecture?
Completely. I think that, you know, I grew up as a curator at the Whitney. What will probably, you know, stand as some of the most significant exhibitions that I made happened at that museum in that physical space. And I also just always loved that building. So it was wonderful to engage with an architect, David Adjay, who also loved that building. And many people in this design see the ways in which, you know, both of us, the brief that I offered, the answer to that brief by David, because I gave the street, the stage, the sanctuary, he added the stoop, right, as a Harlem architectural type. But in so many ways, if you zoom out, there is a way that the kind of intimacy of the Breuer Building, the way you enter into it, the way in which you encounter the galleries, all of that, I think, informs my sense of museum architecture, and some of those hints are there. Now, what I will say is more than that, however, is David Adjay's view of making space for art and artists, right? That's really at core what I think was inspiring in engaging him as the architect for this project. The fact that he has worked so intimately with artists, creating not just personal workspaces and/or homes, but exhibition spaces, and brought that together with his deep commitment to public buildings. And so the combination of those two parts of his practice coming together is really what you see in this building.
Amazing. We have a question about accessibility, but I noticed in both the film as well as some of the static images that you seemingly have really paid attention to a variety of visitors who will enter into the space.
We have, and we will continue to. You know, what one can do when you're building a museum new is you really can start from where the field is. So I know that it is something that in the field that we have evolved into understanding the necessity of all kinds of accessibility, right? Physical accessibility, but all manner, right? So that the institution can be as open as possible. And we have and will continue to refine our approach to that, and have done a lot of that in concert with those for whom, the thinking about this has been their primary work. And so it has been great to be in partnership with individuals and organizations as we've thought about what accessibility means, what it should look like, and how ultimately it should function as when we open the building.
Oh, that's wonderful. I assumed, like so many others, I think, in the field, that when we all closed in March of 2020, that in fact, this might not have been the same experience for you that it was for many other people, because in fact, you were already preparing for a new building. And so in a sense, the March 20 closure had already happened for you months earlier.
That's right.
Christopher Williams asked an interesting question that builds on this idea. He wants to know if the Studio Museum has created a digital space for making its collection available to people nationally and internationally.
Yes, I think like so many arts organizations and others, that expanding into the digital space during the pandemic really was a gift for us to be able to reach audiences literally all over. And I think like so many other organizations, we will not go back from that. Right. So while we are still committed and actually building this physical building, we'll want to welcome everyone to come into it physically. What we know now is that while we're building this physical building, we're also building a digital institution, one that will allow our visitors from everywhere to engage with us at multiple different levels. So that's also an important part of when I think about this construction project. It literally is bricks and mortar, but it also is in the virtual space as well.
A number of people are asking about the residency.
Yes.
And looking back as an art historian to that beginning moment, it is the Studio Museum could have very easily just have been a Kunsthalle.
Mm-hmm.
Great place to show art, an amazing way to bring new artists into the public realm, an interesting way to encourage culture and the interaction of culture with the public. Do you have a sense of what the decisions were then about the collection, and do those early decisions in any way shape your current concern about the collection?
Yeah. I think in the early days of the museum, you're right. When I look at the fact that we were founded around the same time, as institutions say, like the new museum, right? So Marcia Tucker, having come from the Whitney Museum, her answer to that moment was to create a new model, right? An institution that at that time would have a revolving collection, then move to be fully a Kunsthalle, no collection, at all, to really thinking about being artist-centered, thinking about ways of creating new art histories, there's so many examples of that around the country and around the world. I think the Studio Museum founders were very astute in their understanding that the part of their work, which was about changing the field, required it be done within the terms that existed, right, in the field. So that's why museum was important to them, not just in the name, that that's what we were. And a collection was important from that point of view, because it also had to do with what was the idea of the necessity of stewarding a collection. And when I think of the time the Studio Museums existed, there have been moments of great attention to Black artists, and there have been moments of lesser attention. And the Studio Museum's idea in its program, the exhibition program, in the collection, was that this would be our constant all the time, right? I mean, I think you probably often have to wrestle with the question around cultural specificity, right? People ask me all the time, do we still need, a museum defined only for Black artists? And what I say about that is, of course we do, right? Because it's an institution that will always focus, and that depth of focus will enrich our art dialogues, our art histories in the present and as well as in the future.
Is it difficult then to balance, sort of basically going back historically and righting the wrongs of the earlier part of the 20th century, the omissions of the great artists that form a much larger canon from which they have not been allowed in, with the very compelling desire to collect new emerging artists as they are, showing up every day?
I think it's something we have to balance. I think that, our role is one that, yes, we have to stay committed to the present, nurturing, creating space for new artists, creating opportunity, acquiring their work, presenting them, offering them residencies, engaging in commission projects. But we also have to hold and steward the past, these legacies, the artists who were a part of our founding moment, artists who existed generations before them, all of that. And I think that's one of the things about the community around the Studio Museum I value. You know, having this long relationship to the museum means that, Courtney, like you, I've had the chance to be supported, mentored, loved by some of the art historians and curators who were around when we were founded. You know, I'm not only thinking of the directors before me at the Studio Museum, Lowry Stokes Sims, Kinshasa Holman Conwell, Mary Schmidt Campbell, you know, Ed Spriggs, among others. But I'm also thinking about those art historians and curators that lived in our field writ large. I was in Los Angeles this weekend for the opening of the Black American Portraits exhibition at LACMA, curated by Liz Andrews and Christine Kim. And in that exhibition is the artist and curator art historian Samela Lewis, who is 97 years old. Samela was around at the time the museum was founded, and that is how I understand how important it was for all of them that this institution not only concern itself with the past, but engage with the present, because that is where the institution could have its greatest role in the museum field, but more significantly, perhaps even than just the museum field in its narrow way, within the culture more broadly. And when I hear that from those who were around when we were founded, who heard this as the idea, right, and understood all of its potential, it is a very humbling privilege to be the steward of that today.
I have a very similar experience, Thelma, in that our founding director is also a present person in not only the institution's life, but I also feel in my life. And I have, you know, really benefited from knowing previous curators, previous directors, previous staff in general. And it does really give you a sense of, you know, where you're going, what you're doing institutionally.
Yeah, and just about community, you know, institutions, again, we are building a bricks and mortar building, but it really is a container for this community of artists, community of idea, community of colleagues, community, you know, of our neighbors, of longtime visitors, and creating this space to engage again.
Wow. Ann Tucker has just asked a question that I have never heard anyone pose about the Studio Museum's residency program, and this is compelling to me. She writes, residencies are often in rural settings. How has the setting of the residency in the heart of Harlem affected both the residents rather, while their continuing relationship with the Studio Museum? And can I say as well, there are not that many other artist residencies in New York City or in other major cities with this level of density. Is this a question that you've had before?
Well, it is, you know, because in New York, of course, we have a lot of amazing studio programs, right? And this is when you go into the neighborhoods of New York, particularly, you know, post-industrial neighborhoods, there are lots of spaces that create space for artists to have studios and then form community. I think the residency, in the way that it's constructed for us in the museum, physically tied to the museum and our program, because the residents spend the year in their studio. We present an exhibition at the end, something we are still doing. The exhibition of last year's residents opens up at MoMA PS1 in a week, so that continues. But I think the siting in Harlem, and that point is right, you know, that quite often artists are going somewhere where they can, you know, decompress and detach from the world. In Harlem, it's the opposite. And what that means is artists define how that experience works for them. You know, many years ago, half serious, half joking, the artist Glenn Ligon came to see me at the museum, and he took the walk across 125th Street from the A train to the museum. And he said to me, kind of experienced the life of Harlem, the street life, why street is part of the brief. And he says, you know, when you're walking on that street, you are seeing life at so many levels. And, you know, and he said somewhat jokingly, you know, any idea one might have is being played out in some ways in the kind of rich life that lives on the street. So for many artists, the residency provides the ability to immerse into that. And it can come out in their work in ways like Jordan Castile, whose subjects came from encounters on the street. It can come from other ways of just what it means to be within the context of the feeling of Harlem and bringing that into the studio. It can literally be a material relationship, right, to what is in Harlem and that coming in to the work. But in almost all cases, it's about the artist finding a way into this idea of the neighborhood in both its mythology and its lived life. And so that's why we have always felt it's a wonderful corollary to the kind of residencies where artists could be outside of an urban context, but not just an urban context, one that lives so deeply in the way that, you know, a community like Harlem does.
Someone has asked the question that in previous conversations, that public and private that we've had, Thelma, I always manage to squeeze in a curator question for you just because I want to know what you think.
Yeah.
And Denise Mayer has asked, she wonders what Thelma thinks is most important in the role of curator in today's world.
That is such a great question, such a hard question, but I guess I, you know, have very strong feelings about the nature of curatorial practice, you know, and we all know that, you know, the Latin root, you know, is to care. And I do feel like what's most important about curators is to be able to live within a relationship to artist or object that extends beyond the moment of presentation, right? So that to think of our work as being sort of committed to a longer and more significant journeys with either artist or the object itself. And so what that means, maybe, I guess I'm saying is, you know, an approach to curatorial work that isn't just defined by, I'm sorry, that's Harlem outside. So that's what I mean about, you know, living the life of the moment.
It's showing up for you. It's showing up for support for you.
It is, but it really is about, you know, for curators, you know, thinking about curatorial work in a more longitudinal manner, right? And not just, you know, as many curators, when our resumes are read, it's about the exhibitions that we did. When I think about myself as a curator, there is deep pride in those public evidences. But when I think of my work as a curator, so much of it does not live within the context of just the exhibitions, right? It's been about how I have been able to show up physically, intellectually in the world around these ideas of art, how I'm able to do that in relation to audiences, what space I can create for other curators. All of that to me is curatorial practice when I consider it. And when I think about, for me, what has been most productive as a way to contribute, right, broadly and deeply to the field.
Thelma, I cannot thank you enough for showing up for us today.
Just want to thank you, Courtney. And I just want to say, you know, as you know, it was a great pleasure to come up to the gallery this summer and to see the amazing collection again. It's a space that when in New Haven, I always visit, but it was a real pleasure to see the collection on view with you and to see the work you were doing there and to see even the places where we have deep connection within, though one might not think of it, but just, again, this understanding of cultural specificity and the ways in which different kinds of museum types can still speak to each other as we all, right, seek to create profound and powerful experiences with art and art objects and artists for audiences.
Wonderful. Thank you. And please return in person.
Yes, no, I cannot wait to return in person. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I'm really honored that people gave us this time and really hope, you know, to continue these conversations now and in the future, and then to welcome everyone to a new studio museum.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today for Thelma's talk. I hope that you will come back on November 17th at 12 p.m. when Ivana Blazvik, the director of the Whitechapel Gallery in London, will come and be in the same setting and discuss her institution with us. Thank you again, Thelma, and we all look forward to seeing you, hopefully, on 125th Street.
You definitely will, definitely will. Take care. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.